I write about The Office, it seems like once every 2 or 3 months, and there's a reason for that. It's a show that manages to get so much right that its nuances remain interesting all these years later, and yet still I thought that this video about Andy Bernard may be the last time I wrote about the show, and then I recently rewatched this. This is what I would call a mistake. This is, in my opinion, the absolute worst episode of The Office. And it may not even be a close competition. But what's so unique about this particular episode is that it wasn't really supposed to be an episode of The Office at all. In fact, it was supposed to be an episode for an entirely different show, a backdoor pilot. An episode that was eventually shoved into The Office's 9th season and ran alongside that season when the show it was supposed to be the beginning of crumbled and failed. This isn't just the worst episode of The Office, it's one of the worst spin-off pilots ever created. And its 3 biggest problems are almost so obvious, it's almost hard to believe they even exist. This is The Farm.
Would the family care to say something?
You had black hair and then gray hair.
Once Steve Carell left the show, NBC quickly began to accept a simple and obvious reality. The Office, its #1 show, was on its last legs. And they weren't wrong. The show would slowly deteriorate in the absence of this guy. But NBC had what they believed to be a golden paper goose on their hands. So, they decided they were going to create a spin-off. But not a spin-off that carried with it the tone and ideas of the show itself. No, this spin-off would revolve around the least likable, but arguably most interesting character in the show, Dwight Schrute. So, they signed a pilot deal and went to work creating the episode of the show that they would pitch to executives. That pilot was built as the first episode of what you could call Schrute Farms. But The Office was still airing, so they built it as a backdoor pilot. Something that, should the execs not like it, could be stuffed into The Office proper with a few tweaks. That's what that term means. The problem is, the execs didn't like it. In fact, no one really did. Once the episode aired, critics hated it. Viewers gave it a 1.6 out of 5 aggregate rating. It failed miserably, something even this man himself acknowledged. And it's not hard to see why. I think the first thing this strange piece of television gets wrong is the very thing that was supposed to make it interesting.
Nostalgia is truly one of the great human weaknesses, second only to the neck.
The episode keeps the underlying format of The Office, the talking head mockumentary style, but it makes a grave error. The Office works in its format because it feels like you're being brought into the lives of real people who are relatable. The writers have said that their goal was to fill The Office with characters that you know, your coworkers, neighbors, friends, parents. This episode, this spin-off, removes The Office's secret weapon, that relatability. As ridiculous as the show can get, it's grounded in personalities that you see in the real world. Building a show around Dwight and his incredibly idiosyncratic family means you're building a show that immediately exits the realm of reality. So absurdism becomes the only way to write the humor. There's something inherently funny about seeing people that are bad at their job that you can recognize in your life, all trying to coexist. There's nothing at all inherently funny about a socially inept beet farmer and his cartoon character-esque family. The Farm plays out like a show trying to convince you it can be funny. At some point, just not now. It gives you this guy and more of this guy and these people, and at surface value, these people seem like they're ripe for comedic situations. They just aren't really given any of those situations in this episode. And as it's presented to us as a backdoor pilot, the episode stuffs pieces of The Office proper and the people we know into the Farm as well. So we go from this to this, back to this, and to this, all in one episode. That means that this has to compete with and be as funny as this, which, as we all know, has already earned our interest. We already relate to it. I mentioned this recently, but a spinoff is going to carry the expectations of the original. And if it keeps a main character, the expectations are going to be that what you're getting keeps the best of what you know. The Farm removes that relatability, and leaves us with, well...
Totally. Yeah. The people here are like a fart. You know what I'm saying? Like a fart.
But it's also the way this episode kind of overdoes an already overdone portion of the main show that really makes it hard to watch. The talking heads, the confessional moments, when done right, are hilarious, sometimes revealing supplements to The Office. They help the show keep pace, and when used right, keep us the viewer engaged. But they also, towards the end of the show's run, when the writers were scrambling to retain intrigue, often became crutches that the show relied too heavily on. Crutches that too often halted the flow and rhythm of the episodes, that began to feel like the only way the writers were able to tell jokes, or even sometimes move the narrative or characters along. Well, The Farm does far worse. The Farm treats talking heads like they are the show, and treats everything else like the supplemental material. It reverses the function and the positives of the gimmick. And this was kind of a problem with attempting to create a spin-off in the same format as the main show to begin with. They now had to introduce all of these new characters in a single episode, whereas The Office was essentially recreating its first few episodes from source material. They practically already had their scripts, and people already knew what the show was. It was a known quantity. The Farm, however, wasn't, and it quickly turns into an almost comedy of exposition. It is ridiculous. It feels almost incapable of saying or doing anything outside of these moments. It's not even necessarily the abundance of them, it's that the writers seem incapable of making this new cast of characters interesting on their own merit. If you're going to build a show that relies on a family of characters like this, it's fair to assume that their interactions should drive the story. Instead, it's only the moments they're isolated where you get any actual intrigue. The Farm is a masterclass on misunderstanding why something worked to begin with. But I think the real problem with this episode has more to do with Dwight himself than anything else.
Hello, little man. Haven't seen you in a few years. What is this? Oh, God. What is...
Some of the best moments of The Office are the moments where we see a side of characters that we don't get in the actual Office. It's why Dinner Party is widely regarded as the best episode in the show's run. The moments where you see Dwight actually training in karate, the moments where you see the Farm's B&B, where you see Angela's cats in their natural habitat. But what makes Dwight the character so special is the mystery. You don't know if what he says is true 90% of the time. How he actually lives, he's an enigma. So the small peeks you get behind closed doors are unique and often hilarious moments. The Farm removes the single best thing about Dwight Schrute, the mystery, the intrigue. Dwight's life in the office is so interesting because for the most part, you kind of have to imagine the scenarios Dwight constantly tells us he ends up in. The jokes in the show land because he's serious, but you can't possibly imagine these things being real or what they'd look like. The same cannot really be said for any other character on the show. The Farm, however, kind of ruins that. It turns Dwight into a weirdo that we need to understand. And I don't think that was ever the point. For The Farm to have worked long term as a series, not only would we have had to understand Dwight, but we would have had to have access to every facet of his being in life. And it becomes much harder to put him in all of these fantastical situations Dwight's always claiming he's a part of. So Dwight in The Farm kind of just becomes the rock of his family unit. He becomes the normal one, which makes it much harder to write jokes for him, makes him far less interesting, it makes it harder to keep him interesting, and most importantly, it makes it much more difficult to keep us, the viewer, engaged in his story. You know what they say, a magician never reveals his tricks. Well, maybe we don't really need to know how the beats are made either. The Farm, to me, is a failure in nearly every way. Not only is it one of the worst, if not the worst episodes of The Office, but it's also one of the worst spin-off ideas and worst pilots I've ever seen. The idea of more Dwight sounded good on paper, but what The Farm proves is that Michael really was The Office. Sometimes things should end, and maybe the second he got on that plane is the moment we should have gone with him.
What does it say under martial arts training? Oh, okay, I'm gonna have to supplement that. Could I have your fax number?
That is it for today's episode of Nerdstalgic. If you enjoyed this video, press that like button. Also, if you haven't yet done so, press subscribe right next to it. That way you won't miss anything I put out on this channel. Also, next to the subscribe button, as I always tell you guys, is the notification bell. That bell just makes sure you're actually notified when I upload, so hit that little bell as well. And as always, on your screen right now are 2 more episodes of Nerdstalgic, so you can see what else I've done recently on this channel. And I hopefully will see you guys in the next video.